On Canada's east coast, the Atlantic isn't the only thing that's dark and restless. It Came from the Maritimes is co-hosted by siblings Evan and Chelsea, who share the region's fog-shrouded legends, haunted lighthouses, ghost ships, and chilling folklore passed down through generations. It's maritime history at its most haunting. True crime, eerie local lore, and the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. For those drawn to the strange and storied side of the East Coast, It Came from the Maritimes releases new episodes every week. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
There are places where silence isn't peaceful. It's oppressive. Places where time feels paused, as if something ancient watches from the edges of understanding. Wind-scoured rocks, gulls cry without direction, and the sea below surges with a rhythm that doesn't belong to nature alone. These places are real, and some of them refuse to let go of their secrets.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity, venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
It begins with an absence, a routine left unfinished, lives removed, but not with violence, but rather with a shrug from something greater and far colder. The remnants speak of people who were there and then weren't. A chair pulled out, a coat hung too neatly, lights still burning with no one home. Stories passed down through the generations whisper of remote cliffs and impossible quiet, the kind that crawls inside your ribs and waits. One such place juts out from the waters of Scotland's western coast, isolated, weather-worn, almost forgotten. Its name is spoken with hesitation by sailors and historians alike. It is the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, and it is where 3 men vanished into legend. Battered by wind and sea, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse stood alone, its beacon piercing through fog and squall, a solitary eye in the North Atlantic night. For 3 keepers assigned to it in December of 1900, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald McArthur, the world narrowed into a creaking of iron staircases, the howl of the storm, and the silence of their own thoughts. Isolation wasn't just part of the job. It was the job. Lighthouse keeping, particularly in remote locations like the Flannan Isles, demanded a kind of monastic discipline. The men who took up these posts were often cut off for weeks, sometimes months, from any meaningful contact with the outside world. Their routines were rigid, and their companions were few. Their environment was unforgiving. It was the kind of maritime exile where only the constant was the sea. Solitude, especially in harsh natural surroundings, has a curious effect on the human psyche. Historians and psychologists have long drawn parallels between lighthouse keepers and the explorers of extreme environments, Arctic voyages, deep-sea submarine crews, and even space station occupants. In each case, prolonged isolation paired with the environmental stress can distort perception. Time loosens its grip, familiar sounds take on new meaning, a shadow becomes a threat, and the silence becomes unbearable. In the early 1900s, the language of mental health was sparse and often brutal. Nervous ailments and melancholia were catch-alls for conditions we now recognize as anxiety, depression, and psychosis. The idea that solitude could fragment a man's mind was understood, but rarely acknowledged, especially among working men expected to endure hardships with stoic silence. Emotional struggles were hid behind professionalism and tradition. Vulnerability, even in the face of crushing loneliness, was a luxury only few could afford. It is no wonder, then, that legends tend to sprout from places like these. When human presence meets extreme solitude, the natural world seems to echo internal tensions. Isolation becomes a mirror, and sometimes, what looks back isn't quite human. Whether aboard a freezing vessel trapped in the Arctic ice, or inside the cold stone walls of a lighthouse on Scotland's outer edge, the mind begins to ask, what if I'm not alone? What if the sea listens? What if something waits in the fog? In the windswept corners of Scotland's coastline, the Stevenson name is etched into stone and sea spray. For over 150 years, the Stevenson family built more than 90 lighthouses, transforming treacherous shores into safe passageways. Among their ranks was David Allen Stevenson, a master engineer whose legacy includes the haunting remote Flannan Isles lighthouse, completed in 1899. But David's influence stretches beyond the realm of architecture. He was also the cousin of Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island. Together they embody two sides of a singular vision. One gave shape to coastlines, and the other gave voice to adventure. If islands in fiction can breathe danger and mystery, then lighthouses, especially those forged by the Stevensons, can feel equally alive. In David Allen's world, these coastal towers were not passive constructions, but sentient sentinels, solitude figures watching silently as storms raged and ships passed, holding their secrets close. The Flann Light, perched in a remote archipelago lashed by the Atlantic winds, seems less like a toll and more like a character. It doesn't simply illuminate, it looms, it listens, it remembers. Just as Treasure Island's Long John Silver lurks in the shadows, wrapped in riddles, so too might the lighthouses conceal its own quiet tragedies. Within its walls lies the tension between duty and isolation, between safety and madness. For the men who served within, keepers assigned for weeks at a time, these structures became both shelter and psychological crucibles. Solitude bore down with such a weight that it could fracture perception, blur time, and conjure the feeling that something beyond the wind might be watching back. Their legacy wasn't defined solely by what they built, but how those creations spoke to the outside world around them, bridging sea and sky with a quiet authority that blurred the line between architecture and myth. Through Robert's imagination and David's precision, each lighthouse became more than a structure. It became a story shaped by wind, isolation, and the haunting pulse of the ocean itself. Far off the northwest coast of Scotland, beyond the reach of regular ferries, and far from the hum of mainland life, lies a scattered cluster of islands known as the Flannan Isles. Locals call them the Seven Hunters, a name that feels more like a warning than a welcome. These jagged outcrops rise from the Atlantic like the remnants of a forgotten world, cloaked in mist and battered by wind. They are uninhabitable, inhospitable, and steeped in superstition. At the highest point of Eilean Mòr, the largest of the isles, a solitary lighthouse stands against the elements. Completed in 1899, its white tower and black lantern were designed to cast a beam 20 nautical miles across the sea, guiding ships safely past the treacherous waters west of the Isle of Lewis. The structure is stark and elegant, perched atop cliffs that drop steeply into the ocean below. Access is limited to fair weather landings, and even then, the climb is steep. Over 150 feet from the moorings to the tower, aided only by a cable-hauled railway carved into the rock. In the final weeks of 1900, 3 men tended the light atop Eilean Mòr. James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald McArthur, the occasional keeper, called in to fill a temporary vacancy. They were not strangers to the sea, nor to the toll that it could take. Each had served in Scotland's remote stations before, but the Flannan Isles were unlike any other. Remote, barren, windswept, and surrounded on all sides by violent seas. It was a place where even the gulls sounded more mournful. Ducat was the backbone of the post, a man with over 20 years' experience and a reputation for steady, disciplined leadership. He was married with 4 children on the mainland, and he served at other lighthouses without incident. His second, Marshall, was younger and earnest, known for his methodical nature and sense of duty. There were whispers that he had once been fined after losing equipment during a storm, an event that likely left him with a sharpened awareness of risk and accountability. McArthur, the newcomer, was no stranger to maritime work, but was not a full-time lighthouse keeper. Broad and physical, known in town for a hot temper and loud opinions, he was a rugged choice for a temporary support in such an unforgiving station. Together, these 3 men lived under one roof in a stone dwelling attached to the tower itself. Their days were governed by a rigid schedule, set not by whim, but by duty and necessity. The Northern Lighthouse Board demanded that the lights be maintained without interruption. Even in storm, even in grief, someone must always be on watch. The routine was unforgiving. 4 weeks on the rock, endless repetition, with only the comfort of routine to separate one day from the next. They lit and extinguished the beacon, polished brass fittings, kept the fog signal ready. They recorded wind speeds, wave heights, and temperatures in meticulous logs. Meals were modest, cooked from stored provisions, and the occasional catch if the weather allowed. Silence reigned, broken only by the hum of the wind and the grind of maintenance. The sea offered no conversation. Their only contact with the mainland was via the supply ship, a lifeline delayed sometimes by storms. There were no radios, no telegraphs, and no guarantees. On Eilean Mòr, time did strange things. Isolation made shadows stretch and silence deepen. Each man had only his thoughts, the roaring sea, and 2 companions to shoulder the solitude. And as the calendar ticked down towards Christmas, they had no idea they were living out the final pages of a story that the world would never stop retelling. As the calendar turned to December 1900, the Flannan Isles lighthouse stood as always, silent, steadfast, and alone. But on the night of December 15th, something shifted. The transatlantic steamer Anchor, en route from Philadelphia to Leith, passed the lighthouse in poor weather and noticed something deeply unsettling. The beacon was dark. No light pierced the fog. No signal warned of the jagged rocks below. The crew recorded the anomaly in their logs, and when they docked 3 days later, the report was passed along to the Northern Lighthouse Board. It was the first whisper that something was wrong. Days passed. Storms rolled in. The scheduled relief voyage meant to arrive on December 20th was delayed by violent seas. It wasn't until the afternoon of December 26th, Boxing Day, that the lighthouse tender Hesperus, captained by James Harvey, finally reached Eilean Mòr. As the vessel approached, the crew scanned the cliffs for signs of life. No flags flew from the pole. No provision boxes had been left out for restocking. No one emerged to greet them. Harvey sounded the ship's whistle. He fired a flare. But the island remained silent. Relief keeper Joseph Moore was sent ashore alone. He climbed the 160 steps carved into the cliffside, each one echoing the absence of a welcome. At the compound gate, he found it closed. The main door to the lighthouse was shut. Inside, the air was still. The beds were unmade, as if the men had risen but never returned. The clock on the kitchen wall had stopped. The fire was cold. The table was set for a meal, plates arranged, utensils in place, but the food was untouched. A single canary sat quietly in its cage, the only living witness to whatever had occurred. Mòr turned and fled back down the steps, the silence behind him heavier than the wind. Something had happened. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the lighthouse, once a beacon of safety, now stood as a monument to mystery. When the relief crew began their search of the island, the silence was not the only thing that unsettled them. Inside the lighthouse, a single set of oilskins remained hanging, heavy, dry, untouched. It was a detail that whispered rather than shouted, but its implications were chilling. In the brutal climate of the Flannan Isles, no keeper would willingly step outside without his protective gear. Yet someone had. One man had gone out into a storm with only his shirt sleeves. The West Landing told a story of violence, not human, but elemental. Iron railings, once bolted into stone, had been twisted and bent as if by unseen hands. A supply box secured more than 100 feet above sea level had been smashed open, its contents scattered across the rocks. A boulder weighing over a ton had been displaced, rolled from its resting place by a force that defied explanation. Even the tuff atop the cliffs, 200 feet above the sea, had been ripped away, exposing raw earth in jagged patches. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no evidence of departure, just damage, deep, deliberate, and recent. The eastern landing remained untouched, calm, almost indifferent, but the western edge of the island bore the scars of something fierce and something sudden. And yet the lighthouse itself remained intact. The lantern had been cleaned, the oil reservoir was full, the machinery was in working order. It was as if the men had vanished mid-task, leaving behind a scene frozen in time and a trail of clues that led nowhere. Before the investigation began, the only voices left behind at the Flannan Isles lighthouse were the ones committed to paper. 2 sets of records were found, the official logbook, and a slate used for jotting down daily notes before transcriptions. These entries dated between December 12th and December 15th, and offered a glimpse into the final days of routine, and something else, something harder to name. On December 12th, Second Assistant Thomas Marshall wrote of severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. The phrasing was striking, not just for its intensity, but for its contrast with the official weather reports from nearby stations, which recorded no such storm in the area. The discrepancy raised questions. If the weather was calm, what had Marshall seen, or believed he saw? The mood inside of the lighthouse appeared to shift. Marshall noted that principal keeper James Ducat had been very quiet, and that Donald McArthur, known for his toughness and temper, had been crying. These were not men prone to emotional displays. Their reactions suggested something more than bad weather, something internal, psychological, or perhaps even spiritual. On December 13th, the entries continued. The storm, according to Marshall, had not abated. All 3 men were said to be praying. Again, the contradictions loomed. No storm had been reported. Yet inside the lighthouse, the atmosphere was one of dread. The final entry, dated December 15th at 9 a.m., was brief. It read, "Storm has ended. Sea calm. God is over all." No further notes were made. The handwriting was steady, the tone subdued, and then nothing. These entries didn't offer answers. They offered mood. They offered silence. They marked the last recorded thoughts by 3 men who, by all accounts, should have been safe, but were not. On December 29, 1900, just days after the relief crew's grim discovery, Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, arrived on Eilean Mòr to begin the formal investigation. He had personally recruited the missing men, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, and he knew their habits, their temperaments, and their dedication to duty. What he found on the island was not chaos, but a kind of eerie order, an absence so complete it felt almost deliberate. Muirhead moved through the lighthouse with methodical precision. He examined the living quarters, the lantern, the machinery. Everything was in working order. The lamp had been cleaned and refilled. The oil reservoir was full. The logbook had been updated through December 13th, and the slate carried notes from the morning of the 15th. There were no signs of panic, no unfinished tasks. It was as if the men had simply vanished mid-routine. He turned his attention to the west landing, where the damage had been most severe. The iron railing was bent, a supply box had been smashed open. A boulder weighing more than a ton had been displaced from its resting place. Turf had been ripped from the cliff tops, some of it more than 200 feet in the air above sea level. Muirhead noted that the destruction was difficult to believe unless actually seen. It was clear that the island had been struck by a violent force, but whether it was nature alone, he couldn't say. Inside the lighthouse, one set of oilskins remained. Muirhead recognized them as belonging to McArthur. That detail troubled him. It suggested that McArthur had gone out into a storm without his protective gear, something no seasoned keeper would do unless in haste or distress. The superintendent concluded that Ducat and Marshall had likely gone down to the west landing to secure equipment during the worsening weather. When they failed to return, McArthur may have rushed out after them, leaving his oilskins behind. In his official report, Muirhead stated that an extra-large sea had likely swept the men from the rocks. He reasoned that the wind's direction at the time would have pushed the waves inland, not out to sea, making the force of the water all the more devastating. But even as he wrote his conclusions, the superintendent admitted that the evidence was circumstantial. There were no bodies, no final word, nor definitive cause.
The first theory to emerge from the investigation was the most practical and the most tragic. It suggested that the disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers was the result of a fatal accident, born from duty and misjudged timing. According to Superintendent Robert Muirhead's official report, the sequence may have begun with worsening weather on December 15th. The west landing, where the supplies were stored and the mooring ropes secured, had suffered significant damage. Iron railings were bent, the supply box had been smashed open, and the ropes lay skewered across the rocks. It was likely that Principal Keeper James Ducat and Second Assistant Thomas Marshall ventured down to the landing to secure the equipment before the storm worsened. Marshall, in particular, had been previously fined for losing gear in a storm, an incident that may have made him especially cautious. When the 2 men failed to return, occasional keeper Donald McArthur may have rushed out to help them. His oilskins were found hanging inside the lighthouse, untouched, suggesting that he left in haste, perhaps in a shirt sleeves, into the cold and the rising wind. The decision to abandon protective gear hinted at urgency, not recklessness. The terrain at the west landing was unforgiving. Waves could rise over 100 feet, crashing against the cliffs with enough force to dislodge boulders and tearing turf from the cliff tops. Muirhead believed that a single massive wave, an extra-large sea, as he described it, may have surged up the rock face, overtaking all 3 men and sweeping them into the Atlantic. The wind direction at the time would have pushed the water inland, amplifying its force and making it impossible to escape. No bodies were recovered, no cries were heard, but the damage at the landing, the missing oilskins, and the absence of any signs of foul play led investigators to conclude that the men had died in the line of duty, caught in a moment where nature proved stronger than preparation. The second theory to emerge from the fog surrounding the Flannan Isles was darker, less about nature's fury and more about human fracture.
It suggested that violence, not waves, may have claimed the lives of the 3 lighthouse keepers. At the center of this speculation stood Donald McArthur, the occasional keeper, known in town for his short temper and his history of settling disputes with his fists. The theory proposed that the tensions inside the lighthouse may have escalated, confined to a small stone dwelling for weeks, surrounded by nothing but sea and silence. Even minor disagreements could fester. If McArthur had clashed with principal keeper James Ducat and second assistant Thomas Marshall, the confrontation might have turned physical. In this version of events, one man, possibly McArthur, struck out in anger, leading to a fatal altercation. The aftermath, whether driven by guilt or desperation, ended with suicide, perhaps a leap from the cliffs into the sea. There was no physical evidence to support this theory. No blood, no overturned furniture, no sign of struggle. But the idea took hold in the public's imagination, fueled by McArthur's reputation, and the eerie silence left behind. The logbook entries, which hinted at emotional distress and prayer, added to the sense that something had unraveled within those walls. Though dismissed by investigators, the theory of violence and madness lingered, less for its plausibility, but more for its reflection of the psychological strain that isolation can impose. In a place where the wind never stops and the sea never sleeps, the mind can become its own storm. One of the most persistent myths surrounding the Flannan Isles mystery centers on the lighthouse logbooks itself. Over the years, rumors have circulated about a series of chilling entries, notes that allegedly described violent storms, emotional breakdowns, and the creeping sense of dread among the keepers. According to these accounts, second assistant Thomas Marshall wrote that the principal keeper, James Ducat, had become unusually quiet, and that Donald McArthur had been seen crying. In some versions, there are even claims that all 3 men were praying together, gripped by fear as the storm raged outside. The final entry, so the story goes, was dated December 15th, and it simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." It's a line that has echoed through retellings of the mystery, often to suggest a spiritual or psychological unraveling in the house hours before the men vanished. But there's a problem with this version of events. No verified records of these entries exist. The official investigation conducted by Superintendent Robert Muirhead made no mention of such remarks. Contemporary reports and surviving documents show that the last confirmed entries were routine: weather observations, maintenance notes, and a final slate updated on the morning of December 15th. The more dramatic logbook entries appear to be a later invention, likely fabricated to heighten the mystery and feed public fascination. They've been repeated in poems, articles, and fictional retellings, but they don't appear in any authenticated records from the Northern Lighthouse Board. In truth, the real logbook was quiet. Its silence far more unsettling than the imagined cry for help. They stand alone at the edge of the world, stoic, solitary, and endlessly watchful. Lighthouses have been more than navigational tools. They are symbols of endurance, guardians of perilous coastlines, and silent witnesses to the drama of sea and sky. Rising from jagged cliffs or lonely splits of land, these towers pierce the fog with their beams, guiding mariners away from danger and towards safe harbor. But in their isolation, they've also become something else entirely: vessels of myth. For centuries, sailors have whispered stories about the lights that blink through storms. Some say they've seen figures in the lantern rooms long after the keepers were gone. Others speak of voices carried on the wind, of doors that close without touch, of lanterns that flicker when no one is there to tend to them. The sea breeds superstition, and those who live by it often carry beliefs as old as the tides. To mariners, the lighthouse is not just a structure, it's a presence. a place where time bends, where solitude deepens, and where the veil between the natural and the supernatural feels thin. Lighthouse keepers stationed alone or in small crews for weeks at a time became part of this folklore. Their lives were marked by routine, silence, and the relentless rhythm of the light. But in the eyes of those who passed by, sailors, fishermen, and coastal dwellers, they were something more, stewards of mystery, sentinels of the unknown, and in places like Flannan Isles, where the sea never sleeps and the wind never rests, the line between duty and legend begins to blur. The sea has always been a place of wonder and warning, and those who have sailed it carry its stories like salt in their bones. For centuries, mariners have lived by a code, not just of charts and compasses, but of omens, rituals, and whispered beliefs passed from deck to deck. Superstition wasn't a distraction, it was survival. When the sky darkened and the waves rose, logic alone couldn't steady nerves. Sailors turned to lore. They believed that whistling on board could summon a storm, that bananas in the cargo invited disaster, that sailing on a Friday, especially Candleman's Day, was to tempt fate itself. Red skies before dawn were warnings. Flat-footed passengers were avoided. Even the presence of women on board was said to anger the sea gods, unless carved into the prow as bare-breasted figureheads meant to calm the waves. Cats, especially black ones, were revered for their ability to sense weather shifts and ward off evil spirits. If a ship's cat went overboard, it was said to bring 9 years of misfortune. These beliefs weren't confined to the open ocean. Along coasts and in the harbors, tales of phantom ships and cursed voyages took root. The Flying Dutchman, doomed to sail forever, became a symbol of hubris and punishment. In the waters between Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, sightings of a burning ghost ship, its mast ablaze, its crew climbing in panic, has been reported since the 18th century. Locals say it appears before a storm, vanishing just as help arrives. In this world of wind and wave, superstitions became a kind of compass, pointing not to true north, but to the deep fears and hopes of those who dared to cross the sea. And in places like the Flannan Isles, where isolation and mystery converge, these old beliefs still echo in the spray. They are towers built to endure, but they were also vessels for the uncanny. Lighthouses, by their very nature, invite the supernatural. Isolated, exposed to the elements, and often manned by a single keeper for weeks at a time, they become more than structures. They become characters. And in the folklore of coastal communities, they are rarely silent. Across the world, stories persist of lights that flicker without cause, of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, of voices heard above the roar of sea. Some lighthouses are said to be haunted by former keepers who refuse to leave their posts, even in death. Others are said to be watched over by more mysterious presences, figures glimpsed in lantern rooms, doors that slam without wind, objects moved when no one is near. The Maine's Boone Island Lighthouse, the ghost of Kathleen Bright, is said to cry during storms, mourning the husband she lost at sea. At England's Scudder Lighthouse, visitors report shadowy figures and missing items, believing that the lingering spirit of Isabel Darling. In Oregon's Hecate Head, guests speak of Rue, a specular woman who watches from the attic window, protective but ever present. These stories are not confined to one coast or one country. They stretch across oceans and generations, woven into the very identity of the lighthouse itself. The keepers, often alone for weeks, become a part of the myth. Their routines, lighting the lamps, recording weather, maintaining the fog signal, were acts of devotion. And when tragedy struck, as it did in the Flann, The absence of explanation left space for legend. In places like Eilean Mòr, it's easy to believe that something else might be watching. Not malevolent, perhaps, but ancient. A presence born of stone and salt and silence. And when 3 men vanished without a trace, leaving behind a warm meal and a stopped clock, the supernatural doesn't feel like a stretch. It feels like a sigh. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers has inspired theories that drift far beyond the realm of reason into the specular, the mystic, and the deeply uncanny. In the absence of evidence, imagination surges like the tide, filling the silence with stories that refuse to settle. Some claim that the men were taken by a ghost ship, a phantom vessel said to haunt the waters west of the Isle of Lewis. Known in whispers as the Phantom of the Seven Hunters, it is said to sail silently through the fog, its mast aglow, luring souls from the shore. When 3 keepers vanished without a trace, the legend felt less like folklore and more like a possibility. Could the lights on the horizon have beckoned them outward? Could the sea itself have called them home? Others reach deep into the abyss, invoking the ancient terror of sea serpents. In coastal lore, these creatures are said to rise from the depth during tempest, their eyes gleaming, their breath foul with salt and decay. With no wreckage, no struggle, and no sign of escape, some believe a beast from the deep had come for the men in a moment the island refused to remember. The damage at the west landing, the bent railing, displaced boulder, torn turf from the cliff tops, was interpreted not as the aftermath of a storm, but as the footprint of something monstrous. But among all legends, one stands out for its eerie precision. The Blue Men of Minch, said to dwell in the strait between the Scottish mainland and the Outer Hebrides, these beings were described as humanoid, with skin the color of the sea and tempers as volatile as the waves they commanded. Sailors told stories of the Blue Men rising from the water during calm spells, swimming alongside ships and calling out in rhyme. If the crew failed to answer in verse, the Blue Men would summon a storm and drag the vessel under. Some accounts spoke of laughter in the surf, of blue hands reaching from the foam, of men pulled silently from the decks, never to be seen again. Though the Minch lies slightly east of the Flannan Isles, its lore drifts easily across the water. The idea that the keepers might have been lured or claimed by something ancient and aquatic was not dismissed lightly by locals. After all, the sea had taken them without a trace, and in folklore, the Blue Men never leave evidence. These theories were never a part of the official investigation. They weren't written into reports or logged in maritime records, but they endured, passed from sailor to sailor, whispered in pubs, and printed in poems. They became a part of the Lighthouse's legacy, not because they were proven, but because they made sense in a place where logic had failed. Before the Lighthouse shone over the Atlantic, the Flannan Isles held a mysterious history of whispered legends, of ancient rituals, and of customs rooted in both reverence and fear. The largest of the isles, Eilean Mòr, was home to a small ancient chapel dedicated to St. Flann, a 17th century Irish abbot whose name the island bears. The chapel is now a ruin, but it was built in the Corbel-Orier style. Its stone walls thick, its doorway low and narrow, and its roof once raising a steep arc of flat slabs. The lighthouse keepers later named it the Dog Kennel for its cramped dimensions, but to earlier visitors, it was sacred ground. Even after the Reformation, locals from Lewis would make annual pilgrimages to the site, believing it to be the retreat of a holy man. They never stayed overnight. The rituals surrounding a visit to the Flannan Isles were precise and deeply superstitious. Upon landing, visitors were required to remove their hats and walk sunwise or clockwise around the chapel, offering prayers of thanks for safe passage. Before fowling or gathering eggs, they performed a series of divinations. One prayer while approaching the chapel on their knees, another while circling it, and a third at its threshold. Evening prayers were equally strict, and no bird was to be killed after they were said. Violating these customs was believed to invite misfortune. Even the language used on the island was altered. Certain words were forbidden and replaced with euphemisms. Water became burn, rock was crui, shore was ba. The island itself was never called by its name, Flann, but simply the country. These linguistics taboos were meant to show respect, or perhaps avoid drawing attention from forces best left unnamed. And there were other rules. No one was to relieve themselves near the landing site, as that rock was considered sacred. No sheep suit was to be taken home, no matter how many animals were slaughtered, and no food was to be eaten without the knowledge of one's partner. Doing so, it was said, would cause the transgressor to vomit it back up, a punishment seen as divine justice. The island's eerie atmosphere was not just superstition. It was felt. One relief keeper, left alone in the lighthouse after the disappearance, reported hearing men's voices calling to him through the wind. He believed they were the lost souls of the vanished keepers. Others spoke of a strange compulsion to walk clockwise around the chapel ruins, without even knowing the tradition. The turf itself was said to be unnaturally lush, capable of reviving sickly sheep and producing twin lambs. Eilean Mòr was not just a rock in the sea. It was a place where ritual met isolation, where the veil between the worlds felt thin, and where even the most rational minds found themselves bowing to the unseen rules. The lighthouse may have brought light, but it did not chase away the shadows. The isolation didn't just shape the land, it reshaped the mind. And on Eilean Mòr, where the wind never stopped, the psychological tolls may have been the most dangerous force of all. One theory emerged in the wake of the disappearance that was shared psychosis, known clinically as folie à deux, or in this case, folie à trois. It's a rare but documented condition in which individuals in close quarters begin to mirror each other's fears, delusions, and emotional states. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was a crucible for such phenomenon. 3 men cut off from the world, surrounded by endless scene and bound to a rigid routine. If one man began to unravel, whether through paranoia, dread, or hallucination, it's possible the others followed. The rumored logbook entries, though likely fabricated, speak of weeping, praying, and a storm that no one else recorded. Whether real or imagined, the emotional climate inside the lighthouse may have been more volatile than the weather outside. Then there's the most widely accepted psychological angle: misjudgment under pressure. Thomas Marshall had previously been fined for losing equipment in a storm, a financial blow that carried weight in 1900. None of the theories surrounding the disappearance of the Eilean Mòr lighthouse keepers can be proven. There were no bodies, no final word, but each one offers a lens, not just into what may have happened, but into what isolation can do. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers didn't just ripple through maritime circles. It surged into the public's imagination, becoming one of the most enduring mysteries of the sea. The newspapers at the time reported the events with a mix of awe and unease. But it was Wilfred Wilson Gibson's 1912 poem Flannan Isle that truly etched the event into cultural memory. His haunting verses describe the relief crew's arrival, the untouched meal, the overturned chair, and the eerie silence. Though some details were fictionalized, like the toppled furniture, the poem captured the emotional truth of the mystery, the sense that something had gone terribly wrong, and no one would ever know why. Gibson's poem became a touchstone for maritime folklore. It was quoted in Doctor Who and adapted into music by Susie Sue, and referenced in novels, operas, and video games. The Flannan Isles story joined the ranks of ghost ships and cursed voyages, whispered among sailors and retold in pubs, It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a legend. In 2018, the mystery was reimagined for the screen in the psychological thriller The Vanishing, starring Gerald Butler and Peter Mullen. While the film was fictionalized, it drew heavily from the emotional landscape of the disappearances, the isolation, paranoia, and the slow unraveling of trust. It offered one possible answer: greed and guilt. But it left the door open to interpretation. And in the age of internet forums and digital rabbit holes, the Flannan Isles mystery found new life in conspiracy theory communities. Some speculated about secret military operations, alien abductions, or time slips. Others reviewed old legends, ghost ships, sea serpents, or the blue men of Minch. The lack of evidence became its own kind of proof. The story was too strange, too clean, and too unresolved. It all has to mean something more. Today, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands automated and silent, but the mystery remains loud, echoing in poetry, film, and folklore, and in the endless churning of speculation. It's not just a story of 3 men lost to sea. It's a story of how the sea keeps its secrets. In the endless hush between sky and sea, Flannan Isles remain untouched by time. No fairy calls, no voices echoed, no answers rise from the wind. The lighthouse atop Eilean Mòr stands still, its white tower stark against the slate gray, automated now, unmanned, unspeaking. Yet somewhere in its stone bones, the presence of 3 vanished men lingers, not in footsteps, not in records, but in the silence itself. A silence so complete it feels curated. Perhaps the truth is buried beyond the boulders long shifted. Perhaps it was swept into the Atlantic with the men's final breath. Or perhaps it still walks the corridors of the lighthouse, invisible, steady, waiting for a mind curious enough to seek it. The light no longer needs tending, but the story never truly dims. So as you leave this tale behind, I invite you to take with you 3 things. First, let your questions rise in the smoke and not fear where they drift. Second, let your steps follow silence, even when the path is made of whispers. And third, and above all else, let the lighthouse beam guide your way. This is Amanda Joy. Until next time.